Okay, so we've gone through the background essay. We've answered our background essay questions. We have looked a little bit at the timeline, and we've answered our understanding the question in pre-bucketing questions here on page 467. Now you are ready to begin attacking your documents. A couple of important comments on document A, which is titled Major Campaigns of the War. Lee's campaign in 1862 and 63 was dedicated to wearing down the North and allowing the South to secede. And one way this might have happened was if the South had been able to capture Washington, D.C. On at least a couple of occasions after Confederate victories at Bull Run in July of 1861 and at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862, Washington, D.C. was saved by heavy raids that made the roads somewhat impassable. A second way Lee hoped to discourage the North was to invade the North. And if you'll see here, most of the fighting in the major campaigns of the war map, you see most of the campaigns take place here in the South and in the West, with the exception being the Gettysburg campaign up here. And the first attempt was Lee's invasion of Maryland, where he was stopped at Antietam in 1862, located right here. And the second attempt was Gettysburg in July of 1863. After Lee retreated from Gettysburg, Southern armies never again, not once, did Southern armies enter free Northern territory. A couple of other items to consider here with respect to document A are there were two basic theaters of war. The Virginia Theater, located here, and the Western Theater, which would be located in this area, the territories west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1864, a third major theater was created when Union General William Tecumseh Sherman cut his devastating swath through the state of Georgia. So three main theaters: the Western Theater, the Virginia Theater, and the theater here in Georgia, which was created in 1864. Again, to reiterate, as you can see, Gettysburg would be the farthest point north that Confederate forces would make it to, and that would be with the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. And the stakes were pretty large for both the North and the South when General Lee decided to invade Pennsylvania 2 years into the war. As we said, it was 1863. The North really had no major victories in the Virginia Theater it could point to. Lee was coming off a significant win over a much larger Union force at Chancellorsville, and success at Vicksburg was not yet a certainty. Abraham Lincoln had gone through several generals: McDowell, McClellan, Pope, Halleck, and now George Meade, the commander of the Union Army at Gettysburg, and he was searching for someone who could outthink and outfight General Robert E. Lee. And many Northerners were not thrilled with the prospect of freed slaves coming north after the war. It's not unthinkable, ladies and gentlemen, it's not unthinkable that a defeat at Gettysburg would have broken the will of the North to fight. A defeat at Gettysburg could very well have forced Lincoln, after Gettysburg, to sue for peace, to give up the fight, and in effect let the Confederacy have their own country. Okay, let's talk about document B, which is casualties. And a couple of items to discuss while you're looking at this. If a soldier was not present during muster, which was roll call, the day after a battle, he was likely to be counted as a casualty. Casualties included soldiers who were captured, missing in action, wounded, or killed. It also often included deserters, people who left military service without their permission. Total Confederate casualties at Gettysburg have been estimated by some historians to be as great as 28,000. Now, if you look here at the estimated casualties according to this chart, okay, it says the estimated Confederate casualties are 20 to 25,000. When Lee retreated, however, he was not able to take all of his wounded with him, nor was he able to bury all his dead. Confederate casualty numbers are less exact than Union numbers. Okay? The desertion rate from the Confederate Army increased rather sharply after Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The numbers are inexact, but desertions may have doubled. Total number of Northerners and Southerners who fought with their respective armies is uncertain. Some soldiers enlisted more than once, inflating the numbers. A sampling of estimates suggests 2 million individuals may have fought at one point for the North. 750,000 men may have fought at one point for the South. And finally, Robert E. Lee was very aware that his casualties at Gettysburg, though comparable in number, see here between 20 and 25,000 for the Confederate and 23 for the Union, though comparable in number to the Union, the Southern casualties hurt the South more. As General Lee wrote on July 8th, a few days after the battle, to President Jefferson Davis, he wrote, "Though conscious that the enemy has been much shattered in the recent battle, I am aware that he can be easily reinforced while no addition can be made to our numbers." So what General Lee is basically saying there is that the Union, because of the larger population in the Union, it was much easier for the Union to replenish war casualties than it was for the Confederates. And one final point on casualties before you look at the document and then answer the questions. The term casualty requires somewhat special attention. Students, you should be able to realize that battle deaths made up a rather small percent of the total. However, that number would grow, as we've talked about in class, due to wounds that became infected and resulted in death from sickness or disease. So battle deaths, relatively small in terms of the overall casualty rate. Much of the casualties that you see here would have been people that much of the killed, rather, would be people who were injured and then later died from infection or disease. Now moving to document C, which are excerpts from 2 letters written by General Robert E. Lee to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The purpose of the 2 letters is to kind of reflect the mood of General Lee after the Battle of Gettysburg. From other sources, we know Lee was up and down. He wrote his wife during the return with his army to Virginia that "Our noble men are cheerful and confident." He later told a Jefferson Davis aide that "Our loss was heavy at Gettysburg, but in my opinion no greater than it would have been from the series of battles I would have been compelled to fight had I remained in Virginia." On the other hand, Lee failed in his attempt to take the war to the North, and he experienced episodes of sadness and doubt afterwards, and this would lead to his offer in one of the letters to resign. Okay. Also, letters from Lee's soldiers also reflect this mix of feeling after Gettysburg. From a North Carolina soldier who wrote, "The Army of Northern Virginia has not been and will not be whipped by Yankees." But within days, from a South Carolina soldier comes the following quotation. Quote, "We came here with the best army the Confederacy ever carried into the field, but thousands of our brave boys are left upon the enemy's soil. Our army will never be made up of such material again." So you have among Lee mixed emotions about what happened at Gettysburg, and among some of Lee's soldiers you have mixed emotions. Now Lee did not resign, and in time developed a new strategy. He had asked to resign, as you'll read in one of the letters. He had asked President Davis to replace him. He ends up not resigning, and he develops a new strategy. Instead of invading the North, or instead of defeating the Union Army, he would simply hold on long enough so that Jefferson Davis could reach a political settlement with the North that would acknowledge an independent Confederate nation. Remarkably, Lee did hold on for about another 2 years, actually 21 months after the Battle of Gettysburg. He will hold on, knowing at that point he was not expecting a military victory. He was holding on for the opportunity for the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, to reach a political settlement in the war. Final note here for Document C, Colonel or General Robert E. Lee's letters. Lee held his army in very high regard coming into Gettysburg. He was coming off a victory at Chancellorsville just a couple of months before, where his army had won an important victory over a Union force twice its size. Lee expected, before Gettysburg, to win. His biggest mistake was probably ordering an open field attack, Pickett's charge, on the third day of the battle, not fully appreciating the deadly effect that massed rifle fire would have upon his men. As you're answering the document questions for Document C, Lee's letters, I want you to consider the following. Sports announcers, when you're watching a sporting event, and I know my 7th graders all love sporting events. When you're watching sporting events, sports announcers often refer to momentum. Team that loses momentum has really lost its confidence. And I want you to think about, is this what happened to Lee in the South at Gettysburg? Was Gettysburg a turning point because that is where the South lost its momentum, its unwavering belief that it could whip or that it could beat the North? We talk about momentum a lot in sports, and maybe a hint to a possible thesis in your essay here, maybe a hint is that the Gettysburg defeat stopped the momentum of the Confederate forces in its tracks at Gettysburg. And finally, we are up to Document D. Some notes on Document D, the Gettysburg Address, which was written and prepared and read by President Lincoln, spoken by President Lincoln on November 19th at the battlefield, a couple of months after the battle ended. The crowd at Gettysburg that day was made up mostly of townspeople and civilians from out of town. Gettysburg had suffered a little physical damage, but the psychological effect of the battle ran very deep. Many of the 2,500 residents had helped bury the several thousand dead soldiers, the more than 5,000 dead horses and mules, and care for the more than 10,000 Union wounded. The Confederates had taken most of their wounded with them when they retreated, so most of the wounded that were left on the battlefield were Union soldiers. In November of 1863, a few months after the battle, the occasional out-of-the-way body was still being found in the countryside. The speech is part of American lore that Lincoln sketched out his speech on the train on his way to Gettysburg. This was not the case. This is kind of an old wives' tale. Lincoln took the occasion and his remarks very seriously. He wrote his speech in Washington, and he arrived a day early to be certain that he would not be late for the festivities. Lincoln saw clearly the significance of the battle and wished to underline for the American people the larger meaning of the war, that it was a war to expand freedom and perpetuate democracy. In expressing this larger meaning, Lincoln does not demonize or make the Confederacy out to be the bad guy. His speech is very conciliatory, and in fact, there is a sense in which he is including the Confederate soldiers in the solemnity of the occasion. A couple of important points before you answer the questions on the document. Lincoln refers in the opening line of the address using the term 7 years ago. And a score typically would mean 20 years. Okay, so 4 is going to be 4 or 4 20-year terms and 7. So it's actually going to be 87 years ago, all right, from the time that he wrote this and gave this momentous address. So when you're answering the questions here, question 1 is going to ask specifically about 4. You're going to have to do a little math here to determine what 7 years ago is actually referring to when he writes, "Our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Lincoln continues, "Now we are engaged in a great civil war." Remember, ladies and gentlemen, the war was still going on in November. Even though the battlefield and even though the Battle of Gettysburg was over, the war was still going on. So Lincoln continues, "Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. Lincoln continues, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Another pointer on the reading, when Lincoln refers to hallowed ground, okay, when he talks about hallowed ground in the third paragraph, he is talking about ground that is made holy. The soldiers who fought at Gettysburg, according to Lincoln, have hallowed that ground, meaning they have made that ground holy with their sacrifice. And also, final point is that everybody should have a handle on what Lincoln is stating here in his last portion of his address. He wants the American people to resolve, okay, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, a direct mention there to an end of slavery on the part of Lincoln. He is stating specifically a new birth of freedom means to end slavery, and that the people, or excuse me, that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. He's basically saying here that democracy should never perish from the earth. And when he's saying that Americans need to resolve, okay, Lincoln is asking people to commit to making sure, to resolve, to commit to making sure that those things happen, that slavery ends, that these deaths will not have been in vain. In other words, these deaths at Gettysburg will not have been for no purpose, that we'll celebrate a new birth of freedom or an end of slavery, and that the democracy, government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Those are all important ideas contained in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Remember, before you write your essay, make sure you do your bucketing, okay? From our packets, we've already labeled the 3 buckets. They're not labeled up here on this tutorial, but from your packets, we should have these labeled. The first one should be geography. Second one should be losses related to casualties, and the third bucket should be labeled morale. Your task here in the bucketing is to make sure that each of your documents gets placed into at least one bucket, okay? Each document will fit in one of these 3 buckets, okay? After you've done that, you will do your chicken foot, your thesis development, and your roadmap, and on the chicken foot below you're going to write your thesis and your roadmap. Your thesis statement, all of you, your thesis statement should be: the Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point of the Civil War for 3 reasons. The Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in the war for 3 reasons. That's going to be your thesis statement. And over here on the chicken feet, you're going to have your 3 reasons. And I'm going to leave that up to you as you write your essay. But for our thesis statement, everybody's thesis statement needs to be: the Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point of the Civil War for 3 reasons. And your chicken feet are going to include those 3 reasons why it was a turning point.